Well, I'm delighted to be here. I always like to tell people that my father was a Belfast man. His name was Joseph Eric Martin. He married a Scot. I was born in Wales, married a Welshman. Confused.com, I think. But here I am. And I thank you, Marlene. She cajoled, persuaded, and bribed me to come and talk to you about ethnography, which has sort of been my passion for quite a number of years, really. One of my famous stories is that I was very late going to university. I think I missed the bus the first time. And I arrived at an MSc Methods course and said, "Will you let me in? I don't have a degree." And they said, "Yeah, come on in." So I've been schmoozing people ever since, really. And so I first learned ethnography in Cardiff with a chap called Paul Atkinson, who's written just one or two little books about ethnography, which you may have heard of. And his title now is Distinguished Emeritus Professor. And he took me out for lunch last week, and I said, how does that make you he said, even more important than I was before. Have a drink. Okay, so I'm going to try and press a button now or something, and let's see if it oh no, next. Here we go. Right. The ethnography I'm going to talk to you about is, I'm going to try and set the context. And because I get bored with slides, I like to give you pictures. And this research I did in an area north of Birmingham. And it was an area of major deprivation. And I took lots of photographs as I went around and started doing the research. And I always feel it's important to look at all the theory and the words in the context of the reality. And the reality was an area that was pretty run down and not particularly safe. Let's see if this works better. So let's begin. I think it's just worth reminding ourselves what is ethnography and how does it fit into the world of research. Well, it's qualitative, there's no doubt about that. It's a genre of writing which uses fieldwork to provide descriptions of societies. And societies it can be the society of childbearing women living in poverty in Birmingham, or you can do an ethnography of the School of Nursing and Midwifery Studies in Cardiff University, because that is a society, and the same methods are employed to study different societies. It uses observation that's direct and it's first-hand. You can analyse texts, and I was very involved in that activity. And it can be small talk, it can be chats to quite formal, in-depth interviews. It usually involves transcribing, using field notes. Most texts will tell you that it's for an extended period of time. It's not possible to do ethnography on a Friday afternoon and write it up. You might miss something if you do it that way. And it's holistic, and it tries to portray from the perspective of those who participate. So how do you do it? Listen, listen, listen. I don't know if you've realized, but what do professors do for a living? They profess, which means they talk too much. And I've got some very astute grown-up young children who point the remote control at me and press mute. We talk too much. So one of the crucial things about being an effective ethnographer is to listen. And I'm certainly getting better at that. And my colleagues who shared dinner with me last night may have observed that technique and thought it rather unfriendly. But I was trying really, really hard to listen rather than jump in, take over, and give a seminar, which is my norm. So that's my explanation. So you have to listen, and you have to listen very carefully. How do you do it then? First you get permission, and I could spend a whole day now talking about how much more difficult it is to get permission to do anything than ever it used to be. And so you have to be able to persuade committees of the value of the research method And there are still some who ask you for power calculations. And you say, pardon? Well, what statistical test will you be using? To persuade them of the value of qualitative research requires some skill. Okay, and then you have to negotiate access. And I love the phrase hanging about and sussing out. And that's what you do as an ethnographer. You hang about and you try and suss out what's going on. And I think a really good example is if you arrive at an airport, you walk in and the first thing you try and find is the screen and you say, what time is my flight? And where is desk 46? And then you find where have I put my ticket. So what you're doing then is you're hanging around and you're sussing out. And that's exactly the same sort of skills you use as an ethnographer. You hang around wherever it is you're doing it and you try to suss out. And then you find your sample. And to do that, you really, really need a very, very nice bunch of community midwives who help you and open the doors, because without them it won't work. And then you do some interviews, and you have some conversations, and you have some chats, and you watch and you listen. And then you go away and you write some notes. And there's a story about ethnographers that they go to the toilet quite a lot. But this ethnographer goes to the toilet quite a lot and then talks to herself in the toilet. Because somewhere you've got to try and record and write down and get your thoughts down pretty quickly and your reflections on what it might mean. And then you ask some more questions and then you make some field notes. That was 3 minutes on what ethnography is, and there are textbooks about it. Crucially, it is about bringing yourself to the process. And so the criticism has always been that because you bring yourself, it cannot be objective. And that's what I just want to try and tease out a bit in this session. So who says it's not objective? Well, the crucial question is, does the account, the story that's written, merely reflect what the researcher is looking for? I started off researching childbearing women in poverty because I was angry, because I felt their voices weren't heard, because I felt that the National Childbirth Trust had dominated the market and the views of women were merely those reflected by the white and the middle class. And so you could easily argue, where is your objectivity, Shelia, because you merely reflected your own views. And my views were that this was a silent group who needed to be heard. And then the next question is, can the researcher or observer's experiences be useful? I would argue that in doing this research, I couldn't put away the fact I was white, I was middle class, I was working in a university, I'd had years of experience as a clinical midwife, and also I'd been brought up in a pretty, by today's standard, poor household, where money was a big issue, where saving, scrimping, managing was part of the day-to-day agenda. So how could I put all those things that made me me to one side so that I could do a nice, cool, academic, objective assessment and understanding of that society? I couldn't. And will examining the researcher's social location make any difference? A lot of texts argue that if you examine the researcher and their beliefs, then that in some way will add objectivity to your account and to your observations, but it probably doesn't. And will making explicit the processes of decision-making, producing the interpretation, make any difference? So if you systematically set out how you went about it, does that add to its objectivity? And I'm arguing, no, it doesn't. You merely set up the process as you would any research tool or method, any controlled trial. You'd say what you did and how you did it. And that's just as relevant in an ethnography, but it doesn't actually, in my view, add to its objectivity. So I said I would punctuate it with little pictures. And this is one of the main streets where, in the area where I did the study, and these were the two busiest stores, Penny's Worth and Q's Discount. And it just reflected the area and how people spent their money and how tight money was and how they made decisions and where they shopped. And I'll talk a bit more about that as I go along. But it just gives you a flavour of the sort of place where this research happened. So now I want to develop the concept of reflexivity in relation to objectivity. There's a confusion that says the more reflexive you are about your findings, the greater your objectivity. And I think I'd like to challenge that as part of our thinking about it this morning. So reflexivity, it's defined as a tool or a mechanism to analyse your personal, intersubjective and social processes which shape the research projects. What does that mean? It says, how am I what I am? What do I bring? And how does that shape the sort of things that I'm looking for? Does it make me actually go and look for specific things in the study which will reinforce my own predetermined beliefs about whatever it is I'm looking at? It's supposed to, or it encourages the researcher to acknowledge their own role in the research. Now, I was a midwife, and I was researching childbearing women living in poverty. And as a midwife, I was bound by the ethical conduct of researchers, but also the ethical conduct that's required of a registered nurse and a registered midwife, which meant if I saw something that needed an intervention, should I note it or walk away from it? And I'll tell you a story, because I'm an anecdotalist, I'm told, so I can tell you a story. I went into one house to see a woman I'd gone back a few times, and her little boy, who was about 5 or 6, was at home. And it was a school day, so I said, is Johnny going to school today? And she said, no, it's raining. He doesn't go to school when it's raining. Aha, I thought, tell me more about this. Well, Johnny had talipes equinovarus, I think that's the term, not being a nurse, club feet. And he was waiting for surgery. And they'd moved house about 10 times, which was a very normal pattern in that community. Difficulties, you moved house. And somehow the referral for this treatment for his feet had got lost. They couldn't afford shoes to wear on wet days because he had to buy 2 pairs, one in a size 5 and one in a size 6 or whatever it was, because his feet were a different shape and he couldn't get shoes. So on wet days he didn't go to school. So you sit there and think, oh, this is a nice, interesting story, I'll write it up. You can't. You just can't do that. So what you say is, okay, this is how you solve that problem. And you say, you do this and you do that and you do the other. And then you go away and think, should I have intervened? Should I have got involved in that story? Was it my right to tell that mother how to negotiate access through a health system to enable him to get a white middle-class mother? My children went to the dentist, they got to the orthodontist, they took their vitamins, they got vaccinated, but they were outside that mainstream because they didn't know the techniques to solve it. It was solved, the child had surgery, it was sorted, he had shoes, he went to school. So, could I have stayed outside it? No, you wouldn't have either. So, did I have a role in the research? Of course I did. And did I bring my knowledge and experience into that research? Of course I did. Another story was, I went into a house and went in, the baby was born, lying in a cot, and the baby looked to me to be dead. It wasn't dead, it was just not terribly well. It was sort of pale blue, not breathing very well, and very cold. Interesting from a research perspective, one could do some field notes, or one could actually call an ambulance and get the child admitted. And that child had systemic thrush, and that was all to do with the lizards in the room, but I'll tell you about that story later. But what could I do as a researcher but intervene? No option at all. So you cannot disconnect your role, your past and your history from the research that you're doing. Okay. Reflexivity requires you, though, to have an awareness of your contribution to the construction of meaning. And when you gather qualitative research data, that's easy. throughout the country there are rooms full of qualitative data. The real skill is in analysing that data and saying, what does it mean? Or what I call, I think we mentioned it last night, the so what factor. Yeah, we've got it, we've seen it. So hanging about at an airport you collect data, so what? In ethnographic research, it's the construction of meaning that becomes important, and you have to be aware of the contribution that you're making as a researcher to the scene that you're currently involved in reviewing. Reflexivity also argues that it's actually impossible to remain outside that subject matter. And I'll develop that thought a bit further on. You cannot stay outside. You cannot be objective. You can develop all sorts of tools to develop what's called critical distance, but nevertheless, if you're using reflexivity as a technique and as a tool, then you acknowledge the impossibility or the difficulty of remaining completely detached. So why does reflexivity matter? Well, because researchers have been encouraged to dissolve the distance between themselves and those that they research and become reflexive. And I'll talk a bit more about that as I give you more examples, practical examples of how it worked. You can explore the ways in which a researcher's involvement in the study influences and acts upon it and informs the research. Even my very choice of topic and area reflected the person that I was, the background that I'd had, and my values and my beliefs. Why was I researching childbearing women? Because I was a midwife. Why in poverty? Because I felt angry about injustice. So even the very first choice was part of that story. Some believe that the demands to separate are unrealistic and even patronising. So the concerns can be summarised in the following way. How does the researcher filter the data through their own interpretive and theoretical lens? How do you take what you're seeing and translate it into a meaning and a theory? And can you be sure that that theory is real, having gone through your own experience? Will simply being there have an impact on the phenomena being researched? Of course it will. And will the experiences of being in the field have an effect on the researcher? Profoundly. The experience of doing ethnographic research that close in had a profound effect on me, and I'll talk about that as we go along. So I will argue that the challenge to set aside all these aspects, to make the researcher an individual, objective, with individual experiences, is virtually impossible. You cannot do it, but you can be aware of it. So that's my thoughts about reflexivity and where we are. Will you wave to me when I should stop talking? Thank you, Marlene. Shall I carry on?
Keep going.
Keep going. Okay. This house is a really interesting house. You can see that it's boarded up, and the garden is a little rough and ready. There was a woman living with 5 children in that house. She was pregnant. The youngest child was about 11 months old, and the oldest child was about 5 or 6. And the house had been emptied and repossessed by the council, and they were living there as squatters. And the community midwives knew all about them, and she was probably one of my best informants. But that was the house that she was living in. There was no heating, there was no running water, but there was a tap in the garden that somebody had forgotten to turn off, so their water came from the tap in the garden. But I think the picture's powerful to me because it just sort of sets the ethnography in a context. You know, this is not dry clinical, not that clinical research is ever dry, Molly, but this is a very different type of research, which comes with taste, feelings, smells, and all other human things. So I always like to use this site. Do you know that badge is the American Nurse Midwives Association sort of motto, and they have these badges, listen to women. So I tend to wear it around most places until it offends people. but it's on the front of my book, so that's why I put that one in. Okay, so let's just talk about what does it need to be a good ethnographer or a good qualitative researcher. And when we go through this list, you'll see it's very similar to the qualities that make a very good midwife or even a very good nurse. Okay, it involves intensive personal involvement and an improvisational style. You have to adapt. You don't have a nice set of instructions. Frequently you wish you had, but basically you're there. The doors have opened via a community midwife, and you think, now what do I do? And when I go back through my interviews, the early ones was an awful lot of me talking, and the later ones was an awful lot of me being silent. So what I learned through the process was to say less, and to improvise in resolving the problem of access to an orthopedic surgeon, or to get an emergency ambulance, or whatever. That's what it required. Ability to learn from mistakes, because like everything in life, you get it wrong. And one of the things that I learned very early on was that the more I talked, the less effective it was. And people used to make comments about, you've got a posh accent. And I didn't think that I did, but you know, I'm terribly middle class, aren't I? I have received pronunciation, you know, my children went to terribly good schools and then on to Oxford. You don't realise that you pick up these styles. And one of the other stupid things I did was, when you think back, you think, how did you do something so stupid? But I'd been to Harrods in London and I bought one of their shopping bags, you know those plastic ones, green, with Harrods written on it? So in my Harrods bag, I had my tape recorder and my notebook. And you know, how ridiculously out of context was a Harrods bag in that setting? But that's what I carried. I did get the dress right. I'm always jealous of Marlene's figure. Okay, I may as well come clean about this in this. But the style of dress was leggings and baggy t-shirts. It doesn't do a lot for most people. It did even less for me. So I had to learn from my mistakes. Okay, I'll keep on going. Now, I think this is one of my favourite quotes about ethnography. It's not objective, it's not subjective, it's interpretive. And it's mediating two worlds through the third. So what are the worlds? The world of childbearing women living in poverty, the world of academia and trying to get a PhD, and mediating it through my own experience as a midwife, as an academic, as a mother, as a human being. All those things add to the process of interpreting. Okay, I want to talk a bit about doing interviews. I'll just put all these up now because I'll try and talk them through. If you read books about doing interviews, they say find a nice quiet place, make sure that you're not going to be disturbed, and put the recorder on the table and check it out first. First thing is you have to learn how to do interviews with Sky Telly on, loud, all the time, norm. And you have to learn to adjust your tape player or your CD player to suppress the background noise. And you also have to get used to the fact that people wander in and out all the time. One of my best interviews was there with a local authority council gas fitter who was servicing the fire. And he was chipping in, adding comments about what was going on. People wandered in and out. And I got very, very afraid of sort of big men wearing vests with tattoos. I sort of got very frightened. And in the book I talk a lot about, there's a concept of night fishing. And night fishing is a euphemism for going to see your other lady in your life. And I was interviewing one woman, and this guy came in who I knew as Ben. And the woman said to me, oh, that's Ben, he's been out night fishing. And I thought, I can't see his fishing rod, but you know, never mind. I went to the next house and sort of did another interview, and then Ben came in again. I said, oh, that's Ben, he's just been out night fishing. Now, they didn't live close, but neither woman knew that they were actually sharing Ben, and Ben was fishing. I was going to say dipping his wick, but I think that's the wrong term. Night fishing anyway. So if you start doing family trees and work out the genetic pool and how you share that out, it's quite interesting. So visitors were free and easy and moving in and out. Noise, the TV, and other children. Do you remember? No, I won't go to it. But throughout the interview, I translated one interview, and it kept saying, "Sit down, John. Sit down, John. Sit down, John." And so, "Sit down, John," I had to sort of delete and put it in brackets because it was just a permanent punctuation of this really interesting interview about how women relate to midwifery and how they get the care they need and the things that they want. One interview was completely ruined because the woman just started having hiccups all the way through, and that was abandoned. And then another one went into labour, and so that was abandoned. So this balance between warmth and detachment, you had to be a friend, but you had to be distant from it. But you had to create a relationship with those that you were researching. Otherwise, they weren't going to tell you anything. Much, much less of the researcher's voice, as I've said. And I'm going to tell you a little story now about some of the hazards and pitfalls. Being white, middle class, and rather refined, I do have a bit of a passion for posh cars. You know, I've got to come clean. And at the time I was doing the research, I had ever such a nice sort of posh car. And I drove off to do my first interview and parked outside and went in and did it and came back out and there were no wheels on the car. And I wasn't quite sure what to do. And of course the mobile phone always helps. Went back in, said to them, I said, "My wheels have gone." And she said, "Oh, the bastards, leave it to me." So I stuck a note on the windscreen and said, "This car belongs to Sheila. She's a midwife doing research. Please can I have my wheels back?" She said, come on in, have a cup of tea." Now, if you're a community midwife, you know that you've got to be really careful where you have tea for two reasons. One is it drinkable? And two, where do you have a wee afterwards? And they all drink sterilised milk. And anyway, so I went in, had a cup of tea with sterilised milk. And she said, "I'll sort it. Came back out, wheels were back on, note on the windscreen, and it said, "Your tracking's out." Do you know what tracking is? I'm glad you do. It's something about the way the wheels rotate. There were all the wheels, and the note saying your tracking's out. So it was quite an interesting challenge. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about disasters. I'm also, apart from having a fancy for fast cars, I also have a problem with animals. I'm very happy for them to inhabit the planet, but not in my space. I'm just not very good with animals, especially very, very large dogs. And very large dogs that put their paws on your shoulder and copulate against your legs, I find particularly distressing. Okay, move on. So I'm trying now to bring us. I'm trying to be academic because Marlene will tell me off. I want to go back to my motivations for doing the research because that impacts on this whole process of objectivity. That was my starting point. I wanted to understand the experience of childbirth from the perspectives of women whose voices were seldom heard. I've told you that. I wanted to look beyond statistics because all the statistics told you what the perinatal mortality rates were and how many were breastfed and how many were this and how many were that. I also, come clean, felt I had a mission. I was going to look after these women single-handedly. I was going to solve poverty. I was going to put the world to rights. I was going to redistribute wealth. I was going to influence the government. It's what you do. It's what you do. And then you come clean and you realise you can't do anything. I wanted to give them advice. I wanted to respect them, certainly. I wanted to ask sensitive questions. And I wanted to try and help each woman embrace her own childbirth experiences. And there is an awful lot of literature that talks about validating experiences by listening. And I felt that this was a group of women who were just outside the system and therefore didn't have those opportunities. And an awful lot of my data is very much about those sort of things and find their own solutions. I was a bit of an angry radical feminist. Truth is out. I was going to solve injustice in the world. I believe that bad things happen to women mainly because of men. I've modified my language there. If it was a totally female audience, you know, we would use the term illegitimate. I had a passion, and if you are thinking intelligent research, you say, yeah, come on, Shelia, where's the objectivity in this? I'm coming clean with you. I was in the process of encountering an alien world, which was alien to me, and I was trying to explain it, and I was learning about another world and trying to make sense of it, and I'm going to talk to you about the pets. So I set about to do it because I believed that things were wrong, and I had this naive belief that I would put it right. And I'm sure those of you who are involved in supervising PhD students, they nearly all come because they're going to solve the world's problems. And the reality is that one small PhD, I know it's very big, but one small PhD will not solve the world's problems, and you can't believe it. Okay, so Roxy's Pet Shop was a thriving, booming business in the area that I did the study. And my worst encounter was with a very large snake that was coiled in the toilet. I told you I had difficulty in finding somewhere to go to the loo. Lizards were very commonly kept, hamsters and gerbils, and rats. Rats with tumours I found particularly challenging, as were big dogs and cats. And I did did some counting and counted out how many people that I met had animals and how many of them had more than one. And at one point I almost was going to use a statistical package, but that was going too far. I didn't actually pursue that. But pets were a very, very important part of women's lives. And they didn't use the phrase unconditional love, but they did say, pets love you, and they don't ask anything of you. And it was a really interesting part of the work that I did. Okay, sample was, you have to put this in a form of research paper, don't you? It was serendipitous. It was the women who I could get to, who would let me in, who the community midwives knew, and they were willing to give me time. They were all white, and that was not because I excluded very large black minority ethnic population in the area. I didn't exclude them, but they didn't volunteer, and I just didn't get to them. And I didn't work with those women. Okay, and that's just another picture of the area. And these, I don't know if you can see those two little children running. They hadn't been to school for about 2 years. And the school enforcement officer had failed to find them and failed to get them registered at school. And yes, I did have to put aside my desire to educate these children. It was not my responsibility, but I did want to put it right. And those two little kids there had not been to school. Am I still all right to keep going? The thing that I found when you do research like this, you then move to supervising other people. And I think that the thing that bothers most of the students that I work with is theoretical framework. And if you ask them on one of the social evenings, what's really troubling you? They say, what's the theoretical framework, miss? What is it? How does it work? So I'm going to just give you the Shelia Hunt translated version of what is a theoretical framework. And if you want to copy it and tell everybody, that's fine. I had one student. Students have the greatest difficulty in refining the research question because, like me, they wanted to put the whole world to right and they're going to solve all the problems. I had one student, and we'd been working together for about 6-8 months, and she was going on holiday, and I said, I want you to send me a postcard, and I want you to get your research question on the postcard. Dear Shelia, this is my research question. Because refining your I'm going to save the world to one question is the most difficult. The second most difficult thing is the theoretical framework. And the theoretical framework, this is how I describe it to students. It's simply the lens. If you wear specs, you know, that bit of glass, it's the way in which you see the world. And I started this research as an angry, radical feminist. all men were, I've got to say, all men are bastards and we've got to sort it out. The reality is it wasn't like that at all. So a theoretical framework is that lens. It's the philosophical underpinnings of the study. It's the bit that says, what do we already know? What theories exist? The theories about how people learn, how society is organized, how women relate to men. Whatever it is, it's the theoretical underpinnings that explain your research in context. How did you get to that place? How are you seeing the world? What views have you got that distort or damage or change the data that you're collecting? Okay. Simply, it's a way of seeing, but it's crucially important that you know what that way of seeing is, and ideally you understand it from the literature, from your study and refining the question, and it drives the thesis as you develop it. A thesis is simply a story. It's a story of your research. And the theoretical framework is the picture frame in which your study is set. It's your way of seeing what it is you're looking at. Whatever the phenomena you're examining, you're saying, I'm looking at it through a lens, through a vision. And that framework is composed of all the things that have been written about it, all the bits in the literature, all the things that people have said, that have been refined and developed a theory. The best way is to do it before you start. I didn't. I got to the end of my data collection and discovered I wasn't a radical feminist, but I'm coming to that in a minute. Okay. It's an examination of why I see the world in the way that I do. And you could argue that it's a move towards being more objective. So in my research, I started off as a radical feminist. All men are wicked. The socialist Marxist version of feminism came in later. It was about the division of labour and who had money and who had power through money. And men could work and women couldn't work because they were pregnant. Went out through the window. Liberal feminists, which was all about sharing and equality. And then I became a post-structural kind of feminist. And I was home at last. Ideally, you should start there. But I didn't even know enough about it. You know, we all pretend we know, and we don't. And it was really towards the end of the data collection with the analysis that I realized that actually, well, someone helped me. It was called a supervisor. The supervisor said, have you thought that maybe you're a feminist post-structuralist? So 6 weeks later, after I'd read everything about it, I thought, yeah, I am. But I'll come to that in a minute. Okay. What feminist post-structuralists say is that your knowledge is always partial, incomplete and interpretive. Well, of course it is. How could I know everything about childbearing women living in poverty in Walsall? I couldn't. I only knew a little bit about the women who I'd interviewed. I also know that I brought nothing to the research less than my own life experiences and my background and my values and my beliefs, how I brought up my children, my relationships. That's all that made me me. And those experiences, this is probably the most crucial part of this, those experiences dictated what I saw. I was blind to the things that weren't in my own context. They dictated my own reflections. They dictated the questions that I asked. And that's the essence of it. I brought to that research Shelia, her background, her experience, her values, her beliefs. And once you get to that point of stopping trying to deny that and becoming more objective to get more scientific credibility, then you get to the essence of what ethnography really is. Okay. Oh, this is a good slide. I don't know if what it says, due to high demand and low prices, farm stores chips are limited to 6 packs per customer. Now, the reason I put that there is that that reflects part of my values and beliefs. I thought the most wicked thing in the world was eating pot noodles followed by frozen chips. Why? Because that's what my mother told me. And my children, you know, as they've gone through therapy, have said, why were we never allowed pot noodles? And why were quavers more expensive than crisps? I didn't know that they were, but you know, children come back and tell you these things. So why did I photograph that in the local farm stores? Because it said something to me about my values. And yes, they sold thousands and thousands of packets of frozen chips because they were cheap, so that, to the extent that they had to limit it, because that was the diet. And I got terribly middle class, and I used to observe, in each house I went, could I find a fruit bowl so that I could make an analysis of diet? How arrogant. No, there were none. Fresh fruit was not part of the agenda. So it's an example of how you bring what you are to the phenomenon that you're researching. Okay. Oh, a bit more of the rubbish, because I'm a tidy person, you know, I can't do with rubbish. Why couldn't they clear it up? But there we are, that's another one. It's okay to carry on. Okay, just a little bit more about feminisms and post-structuralism, because it is quite important, because that was my theoretical framework for the context of the study. Okay. Like most things, there's no simple definition of either feminism or post-structuralism. I always like Beasley's phrase, and she said it's a troublesome term because it's difficult to describe. It's complex, it's diverse, it's a continuum from the most radical feminist to approaches that are influenced by post-structuralism. And this is what I'm just going to run through this to try and explain how I got to the point of being a feminist post-structuralist in the context of analysis of this data. Briefly, feminisms and feminist theory, they're not a united movement. I think in the heady days of the 70s, people thought they were all the same. But there's a general underlying sense of concern about women. Women get a poor lot in life is the sort of shout of the radical feminists. Of course they don't. It's a belief that there's something wrong with society's treatment of women, that they're systematically disadvantaged and even exploited. And I mean, I could speak for hours about the number of women in senior positions, what percentage of women are professors, how much women earn compared with men, the sexual division of labour. We don't have an equal society, fact. But whether radical feminism is an explanation or a solution for that is another matter. And in fact, feminisms have moved on, and they've not softened, but they're actually looking much more realistically about what's there. There's another house. It was the tyres that distressed me there. It was I just couldn't understand why nobody wanted to clear up the environment. Living on a nice middle-class estate, it wouldn't do. Okay, let's move on. I'm going to skip this bit because I think it's probably getting a bit heavy. Is it post-structuralism? Well, it comes from Foucault. If your supervisor tells you to go and read Foucault, take a week off. And then there's a really good book called Foucault Made Simple. It's like a ladybird guide to Foucault. And if you start there and then move on, Foucault is brilliant. Foucault's observations and understanding about the way society works are really brilliant. I'll just give you an example of a bit of Foucault that helped me to understand. He said, if you look at the design of hospital wards, there's the patients and there's the nurse's station. And the more important you are as a nurse or a doctor, the further away physically you are from the woman or the patient. So that the consultant is way down the corridor over there, but the cleaner's bucket is right in the middle of the ward. And so the physical distance is how we create power in relation to distance. That's a really interesting example of Foucault's work. Now, Foucault provides the underpinnings for feminist post-structuralism. So I recommend the Ladybird Guide to start. Okay. And post-structuralists criticize the attempt to build what we call grand theories. They say, you can't get to a grand theory. Have I got a grand theory of childbearing women living in poverty? No, it just didn't work. We can only understand the world in partial, specific and local ways. I can tell you what I understood about those individual women and the way they were making sense of their life and their experiences and their environment. So feminist post-structuralism is a theoretical framework, it's a lens, it's a way of seeing the world. And once I understood feminist post-structuralism, then I could see the data that I was collecting about women in some sort of context. It was the theoretical friends. So was my theoretical friends that a radical feminist? Sadly, no. And the reality of my research findings did not match my rhetoric or my preconceived theoretical or way of seeing. These were not oppressed women, wicked men who were powerless and just doing what they did. That it just didn't work at all. So shock horror, sadly, I had to move on and come clean and declare that I just wasn't a radical feminist anymore. My rhetoric didn't match the complexities of the lives of the women that I was studying. Far from powerless victims, they were very strong women, and they were surrounded by powerless and restless men, and the men were restless and powerless because of economic disadvantage, because things like the minimum wage meant they didn't get work. It meant that the women actually were the power in the households in which they worked, in some of the situations. And by concluding, because I started the idea, you see, that if we redistributed wealth, we'd solve the problem of poverty. I did write to Tony Blair, but he didn't change the whole world overnight. But it ignores the subtle differences between individuals. So at this point, I knew the theoretical underpinnings of my research had moved on from the anger of radical feminism. And my supervisor used to say, can you get off your soapbox? Can you stop being angry? And can you start to see the reality and the complexity and the overlapping themes in the women that I was working with? So post-structuralists, just to give you the essence of post-structuralism, say there's no definite answer, there's no responses, reactions are determined by individuals, and therefore you cannot impose universal solutions. So the Sure Start program, which was really, really an important intervention in lives of the women such as this, really worked with some, but it didn't help everybody. And state solutions, government solutions, tend to be structural. They tend to try to change the structure of society, and they may or may not work in individual women's lives. But there's an assumption that when the state produces a solution, it will improve the lot of most women. Okay. Post-structuralism says there's no right answer, there's no certainty. And I kept trying. I kept trying to find the answer. And I kept trying to find solutions. But it didn't work at all. And my neat data, and data is plural. Have you got that? Yes. Data were not neat. There were inconsistencies, there were irregularities and inexplicable differences. So my attempt to neatly box these women into an oppressed group for whom the state would provide the solution was not true at all. Okay. Shall I carry on? Right, okay. I just want to talk a little bit about analysis, because the most difficult thing about dealing with qualitative data is analysis. And I have a personal grouch, and that people over-rely on packages. And they're very, very good, but they really don't do the thinking for you. They organize data for you. There's Nudis and Ethnograph and all these packages. And what they do is put it in order. And I'm the sort of person who likes a big piece of wall, the garage, and I like Post-its and big sheets of paper, because that's how you think about it. And the process of analysis is the thinking, and any computer package in the world will not do that for you. That's my personal view, and I'm allowed, because I'm old now and a professor, I can say. I think you have to be completely immersed in the data. I used to play the CDs all the time to listen to the voices. You have to be immersed. This one will go down really well. I don't think anyone can transcribe your interviews, only you. And that's how you totally immerse yourself in the data. When people come into Shelia, can you sign this off, please? It's paying for transcription. So I always give them my little spiel. I think you have to revisit, you have to go back to women, you have to go and clarify, you have to go and ask them again. You have to say to them, this is what I think you said. Is that what you meant? And that process of checking is a very important part of the analysis. And you have to keep thinking, and you have to keep listening, and you have to try and understand. And out of it, you begin to synthesize. And that's what takes you from first degree to second degree to PhD. It's the synthesis, and that's the bit people struggle with. And what they do is write beautifully about what they found. And I say, yeah, what does it mean? Where do we go from it? What does it matter? And that's the synthesis. And the synthesis is the most difficult. And it's the synthesis that earns you your doctorate. Nobody ever wants to come to be supervised by me. We do have such fun. Okay, so you contextualize and decontextualize and theorize, and you recontextualize, and you're trying to make sense of the data. And I think thinking, packages help, but the thinking is the real difficult thing. And do you know, doing a PhD, what you're really required to do is think, isn't it? So you say, what are you doing? Oh, I'm collecting the data. Yeah. When did you think? And we live such manic lives that we don't think. And what academics do is think. And the best academics think the most deeply. And they challenge, and they think again, and they ask questions. Say, well, why might that be? Why should that be? What is this data telling me? And it's the thinking that people, I just think, my experience supervising listening to midwives is that's the bit they find the most uncomfortable. They would much rather do than think, because they're used to doing. They spend their day job doing. And you sit them down and you say, I want you to sit there for 5 minutes and say nothing. Which I just make tea. No, 5 minutes and say nothing. Magic things happen when you stop. Leave a space and allow thinking to take place. I don't think I've got time to do this. You have to read the book. Managing the money was a huge issue. Christmas was a huge issue. It came on the agenda when the clocks went back. That's when the trees came out. Managing Christmas in a very consumerist society when you're living in poverty is a really, real challenge to most women. I've talked to you about pets. Diet, food and shopping was a huge area of concern. When you shop, how you shop, which shops you go to. Strong women and restless men. The women were strong. They weren't these powerless, defeated, pathetic people at all. They were the most capable women. And they were surrounded by men who had lost their function in life as hunter-gatherer providers because there was no work in the area. And so we had night fishing and a few other variations on the theme. Putting up and putting off was really interesting, and that was why women stayed in relationships, even though they put up with them and they put off doing anything about them, because life was too difficult dealing with the day-to-day to resolve the bigger problems. And that's, I think, how a lot of people live. They put up, they carry on, because they haven't got time and energy to do it. In terms of midwifery practice, what they said more than anything is, all I want is a bit of respect. And some midwives tended to make judgments about people by their postcode. They knew they came from this area, they knew that their occupation was unemployed or single, and they made judgment about them. And crucially, what these women wanted more than anything was a bit of respect. Okay, and that's the book. And shall I stop there? Because I probably should. Thank you for your attention. I could have gone on for 3 hours. Thank you, Marlene.